Okay. So I have a little soapbox that I get onto every so often about this, about dyslexia, because I think thinking about reading disorders or reading disabilities or what's happening with our kids, we often push and push and push. And that pushing can feel really overwhelming for kids, right? So you start to notice that they're having issues in first grade, first grade. They kind of come in and you're noticing. You're not testing because you're not a diagnostician, but you're noticing that there's these issues going on with how the kid is learning to sound out, how many letters the kid knows, what sort of sight words or high frequency words the kid has over time, and you start worrying. And when teachers start worrying, which we're worrywarts, we want it to be good, we want to work on it, we want to be the best that we can be so that the kids that we have can be the best that they can be. So we start worrying about it. And in that worry for a teacher, quite often what happens is that they try to do more and more and more. And the more and more and more isn't actually what kids need. They actually need it to slow down a little bit and lots of practice at it. Okay, and that's for any kid, but certainly for dyslexic kids. Okay, practice at what they're doing. When you see them not able to do it, doesn't mean give them more. It means sort of back off, still be available, but that they have more time involved. Time is a very important thing for a dyslexic kiddo because it takes more time for them to do a task. When it takes more time for them to do a task, it also means that they're using so much of their brain to have it happen. They're working the whole time on it. Their brain is moving the whole time. It can be very tiring. If you have ever learned something brand new that you think is hard, especially when you start something, it's hard. So you get in and you're doing something that's hard and it requires your glasses. It requires a lot of brain work. It requires you having some quiet maybe. But there's these things that it requires of you and you can't do it for 24 hours. You're not going to be sitting there doing something really hard for 8 full hours. It can be anything that's hard, not just reading. It could be roller skating. Have I told y'all the story about the Paletta guy? Anybody? Y'all remember this story? Okay, so it's like that. Thank you for answering, Liana. Yeah, so it's kind of like that. Like if it's taking me so much energy to learn how to do it, I can't do it for 8 hours. I'm not out there roller skating for 8 hours. I might work on it for an hour and then I'm tired and exhausted. If you are tired and exhausted, after about 2 pages of reading in the textbook, you're like, I'm tired. Or you start doing the slow eye close where you're reading but the eyes are closing. It's because you used a lot of your brain to do it. If you were reading a fun text like a romance novel or a mystery novel, you might read 6 or 7 pages before you start falling asleep. But your textbook, you're even sitting up, you're at the table, you got your pencil, you got your glass of wine, you're ready to go, and then it's like, oh my God, this stuff is just zapping me. So imagine that happening for a kid who's 8. Every time they try to do something, it requires so much mental energy, so much that they end up having 1 or 2 ways of being in the classroom. They are a behavior problem, right? So instead of falling asleep, they throw their pencil, or they start causing problems with the person sitting next to them, or they don't sit in their seat, or they have all these ways of getting out of having to do the task because they tried to do the task, they worked on it for 10 minutes, and it's too hard. So then they start being their behavior problems. The other way that happens is, and it's often with girls, so boys in general are the ones who have the everywhere, and we want to label it as ADHD, but really what it is they're trying to get away from the task. Okay. Then the other ones that you have sit there. They sit there quietly with the task at hand in front of them. And when you walk over there, they have their pencil and they're ready and they're just looking at it. And so those are often really hard because those kids, I think of them kind of like barnacles. Do you know what a barnacle is? Like it's on the bottom of a ship. And the ship goes ahead. The classroom is the ship. And the ship goes on moving, whether it's slow or fast, it goes on moving. And the barnacle comes with the ship, but they're always underwater a little bit. They always are struggling. They're never on the ship. They're like under the ship and around the ship, and they're going with the classroom, and they're trying to utilize what's happening in the classroom, but they're always underneath the water. They're always a little behind. And so with dyslexic kids, specifically, dyslexia, let me come back to the beginning here. Dyslexia is the only reading disability that we diagnose in our schools. Where did I go? Let's see here. Let me share with you. Share. Okay. So dyslexia is the one you're going to be looking for. It's the most prominent. You can just have a generalized reading disorder that's not dyslexia, just so that you know. Most of our districts here would never diagnose that. The only time you would have that kind of diagnosis is if you were with Scottish Rite or NIHouse, those sorts of programs that have true language people who are like basically psychiatrists of language there. It's a huge program. It's very difficult. It takes a long time to go through. But somebody that's in those sorts of programs might be able to diagnose. In our schools, we only see dyslexia. Okay. Now, I would argue also that dyslexia is more prominent than we think it is. That's why we're starting to see more diagnoses now. It's not that in 1980 to 1990 we didn't have dyslexic kids. They just didn't really know how to test them. Certainly not at a school. You would have to pay outside to Scottish Rite to have testing done. And most parents that have kids don't spend that money, and they don't have that money to spend. So there weren't really diagnoses of this until in the 2000s, right? So late 90s, 2000s, you're going to start to see more. And we will continue to see more because about 5% of the kids that are in our classes or in our schools have dyslexia. Now, first thing to remember about dyslexia, it is a high intelligence disability. What that means is no kid should be in special ed and have dyslexia. Those two don't go together. So if you are out in a school and you are sending your special ed kid to go to special ed language arts and you know that they have a dyslexia label, they should not be in special ed. They shouldn't go there. They should actually be headed to a 504, which is an intervention class that's small group or individual, one-on-one, one with the teacher. That's hard because they do usually leave your class to do it or you're having to do it after school. RTI, response to intervention. I know you guys have learned that in other classes. A dyslexic kid falls underneath RTI, so that means that they're probably going to need supplemental instruction, so they become Tier 2 or Tier 1 immediately because of the 504 designation. But they should not be in special ed. In special ed, you will have kids who don't read well. You will, because reading is hard. Most kids in special ed are at least one grade level below where they need to be, at least. And that's in all areas. Right? So they struggle in all the areas. They also do not have, they struggle with regular tasks. They are truly somebody who needs different kinds of instruction than a kid who is dyslexic. So what happens is if a kid is put into special ed, they are working in their classroom at a level below where the typical or normalized kid is, right? Your regular fourth grade kid is working up here, just the regular fourth grade level. And then you've got a kid who's in special ed who's down here. These kids need supplemental help in all the areas because they're always behind. This is why once a kid gets in special ed, they're always there. It's awful to say they don't get out. Most kids do not get out. I've seen it in 20 years one time that a kid got out and moved back into a regular classroom. The only time kids get out of special ed is when they get into junior high or high school, where you now have honors classes, regular classes, honors classes, and elite AP or BA classes. So if you're a special ed kid and you come into high school, you're probably going to be put into a regular classroom with some special ed services on the side. But you'll not go into the honors class or the gifted and talented class. Dyslexic kids can absolutely be in your gifted and talented, just so that you know. I've seen it several times, and it's like a dual exceptionality. That means that they have dyslexia, that's one thing, and they also have gifted and talentedness, usually in mathematics and creativity, but they've got it, so they belong in there. And the reason they would belong in there, to get into a gifted and talented classroom, you have three things that you do. One is your regular STAR test, right? So that does math and that does reading. Then you have a creativity test. And it sounds funny to say, but we can even test kids on creativity. So you have creativity tests. And then you have a regular grades and things like that. And so what'll happen is a kid scores high on their English language arts and high on creativity. They can go in English language arts. They show high on mathematics, high on creativity. They can go into gifted and talented. And so you absolutely can have a kid who's dyslexic but shows high in math and creativity. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't pass in reading. It just means that most of the time when kids test and they're dyslexic, they test low. Anyway, so that's a dual exceptionality. You can't have it. You would not have a kid in special ed who has dyslexia. Okay, they need to be getting 504 services. And you should tell parents as you're working with parents, and I know it's going to be like a year for most of you before you do this, but take this to heart. Parents try their best. They do. And even though they don't do what you're going to ask them to do all the time, they do try their best. And so you have to keep that in mind, because one of the pieces for dyslexia is that you ask their support at home for the things that you're doing. I would say a home visit is a really good thing to do at this point as well. Okay. All right. So let's kind of get started. So first of all, reading problems, we noticed them in the late 90s, but it wasn't until the early 2000s that there was a law saying that, hey, you have to pay attention to any of the disabilities that are going on, not just special ed, not just physical disabilities, like having wheelchairs, making sure things are accommodating that way. But we also need to see that every kid can have success. And that specifically was started with IDEA, Disabilities Education Act, and then moved into, it sort of morphed a little bit later. And in that special ed piece, the law followed the definition that was given by the Dyslexia Association, saying, hey, kids who have been diagnosed as dyslexic have to receive services at the level that they're at. Okay, that it's the government's role and the district's role to make sure that that happens. That when a kid is showing low, that they meet these particular criteria, and the teacher has kept up with a notebook and has examples of work and things like that in a portfolio system, that they need to be tested. And if they test positive for having dyslexia, they seem to have this issue, they must receive services. So the problem with that is, oftentimes what I've seen is districts and schools specifically, who don't want to test kids because they don't want the kid to have a yes and then have to provide services for them. Like if they already have, 100 kids on their campus that have dyslexia, they don't want to add any more in there. Not because it costs them more money, although it does, but because it means more kids that we have to find something to do with. And they're thought of like that, like we have to fix it, find something to do with. Such an awful thing to think that we would imagine human beings like that, but okay. So it started with IDEA, and it became a special education, it fell under the umbrella of special education. However, it had its own wing at the time. So now it's got its own little kind of handle that comes down on the umbrella that is reading disability or reading problems. Whereas before, it was just like, if you have reading problems, you go to special ed. This now should not be that we see dyslexic kids in special ed. All right? Okay. So with that being said, here is your sort of definition. And the big thing to take away from this big definition that they used is that a couple things. The first one is that it's neurobiological. What that means is it has to do with the neurons, the nerves, and the synapses that are in your brain. And that it's biological, meaning that if someone has dyslexia, it is highly likely that one of their parents did as well. Now, it might not be likely that they have the diagnosis of dyslexic, but they will often have a lot of the symptoms of being dyslexic, but they won't have been diagnosed because you're just now getting into kids. You as a parent at 20 years old are just at the level where we were starting to test. We were starting to test in the 2000s. So those now we're seeing some parents that are 20 to 25 that have a child that we can then see, hey, if I put you in an MRI machine and I shove the mom in there, and I show her text, so she's in there and she's looking at text, and I'm watching her brain look at pictures and then text and all this stuff, and I'm seeing how it fires, like what fires in her brain, and I'm looking at where it fires and how fast it fires. Okay, so I put the mom in there. Then I stick the kid in there, and I'm looking at the same thing, how it fires, what areas it fires, what lobes is it doing, how fast is it going, and we can see that neurobiologically the kid is very similar to the parent. That makes sense. And it should make sense to you, because just like when you have a baby and you're like, oh my gosh, he has my eyes, and he's got grandma's smile, and he's got, daddy's hands, and he's got these big shoulders, and so you start kind of putting out the physical features. Your intellectual features also are very neurobiological. Now, that doesn't mean that environment's not important, like nature versus nurture. All right, so nature is 50%. Like, it is part of the issue. That when I look at your brain, you're very similar to the brain of your mom or the brain of your dad. Like, it makes sense. Just like you have hands, you have something similar. But environment does matter. You can make environmental changes that shift the way your brain works. You can. And actually, lots of areas depend on you for that. So if you are needing to shift the environment to be more in control of your food, you might go to Weight Watchers or find a program that's going to help you do that. If you are someone who needs help with or you're interested in anime, let's say, you might find a group that helps you to become even more interested in that. Somebody who can talk that with you. That's the same with dyslexia. They need additional help. So what kind of help are you looking for when you are needing to help a dyslexic? Well, the first thing is if they're having difficulty with accurate and fluent word recognition. They're not fluent. They sound kind of broken, and the prosody of what they are doing does not sound like oral speech, which is the goal of reading. I'm not a big believer in timing, right? So number of words per minute often is what you see on Fountas and Pinnell and other IRIs. Remember, informal reading inventories, you'll see this where they want to calculate how fast the kid reads. For me, in my experience, when I calculate how fast a kid reads, it means that they see me with a timer or on my camera or whatever saying, okay, go. When you tell a little kid, all right, get ready, set, go ahead and begin. What do you think the little kid does when you say go? Yeah, Francisco, it does cause a lack of understanding. What do? They rush. Liliana's got it. Like, they just rush. They're like, go. Go means run. And so often with our kids who are struggling, they think that the faster they read, the better the reader they are. Which we as teachers are like, no. Like, I'll stop kids during a test when I hear them reading so fast. I'll stop them and say, can you slow down a little bit? I can't follow you. We know that if we tell kids how fast they need to go, they start to rush. And then comprehension breaks down, right? Because they're rushing. Okay, so they struggle with accurate and fluent word recognition. Poor spelling. They're your ones who do a spelling test. I mean, they seem fine in your class. They're really with you. They talk a lot. They have great things to say. They ask good questions. They're always participatory. And then they fail a spelling test every week. And you're like, what the heck? So they have poor spelling, and poor spelling comes from poor decoding. Like, it's hard for them to take words, especially the older that they get, and equate them to your memory. Because you were trying to memorize all the words in first grade, and you kind of were pretty good at it, but by the time you get to third and fourth grade, there's too many words. You have to be able to use your decoding strategies in order to sound out the word. And a lot of our dyslexic kids, because it was such a hard thing, they just started memorizing all the words. They're smart. So they come up with something that ends up being a problem as they get older because you can't memorize everything. You don't really have a photographic memory. Although I will tell you, most dyslexic people are pretty good with their memory. But they spell poorly and they decode poorly, which is why they spell poorly. Okay. So first part that you need to remember, it's neurobiological. Second part is that it's the phonological component of language. It's a phonological processing issue. It's how fast they're able to process what is happening on the page in their brain. And I showed this really amazing picture. I should put up something better. What did I do with my picture? I don't know what picture it is. This is not the picture. This is the other picture. Hold on. I'm looking for some synapses here. Yeah. Okay. So neurobiological means that when we actually look at what lights up in your brain, so if you were in an fMRI, we'd see different colors. We'd see how the synapses, how the different neurons fire. Because as you're starting to understand something, they fire. And they fire for dyslexic kids slower than other ones. And so I'm going to show this my amazing picture here of a neuron, two neurons actually. So this little circle part is the nerve cell. And then you have a dendrite, which sort of sits off, looks sort of like a little branch, although these are soft. And then they connect to other dendrites. So here's another one, and they connect. So in the middle of these two things is the synapse. And this is where the chemicals come out of the nerve cell, are brought through on the dendrite. So they come out here, and then they meet in the middle, causing learning. The more of these you have, the more connections that you create in your brain, the easier it is for you to find particular information. The older we get, the bigger those pockets are. So the faster they fire. And then after we hit about 45, sorry guys, I'm in this bracket too, we start to demyelinate. So our brain actually starts to, some of these synapses, so if these are the synapses, right? Like in the middle, here's the synapse, here's our dendrites, so two dendrites are here. So as we get older, these things start to move slower. Okay, like move slower. And as they move slower for us, we start to demyelinate, they start to break away. And so we actually start losing some of our ability in some areas to learn as quick as we did. So if you feel like it's taking you a longer time because you're older to read something and to understand it, it might be. It doesn't mean you're not good at it. It just means that you're now slower. And as somebody now who, in my late 40s and going to school, and I see the young ones, I'm like, yep, they just remember more than I do. They just do it faster. when they study. Okay, so there's sort of your neurobiological piece. It's neurobiological, and it's very unexpected because when you talk to the kid, they can talk about anything. They've got interests. They love to do science. They're interested in all the social studies stuff, but they struggle when you put text in front of them. That's the phonological piece. Okay? So dyslexia, you need to know it's neurobiological. You need to know it's phonological. It's a phonological component of language. So it's how phonemes work. And then that it's unexpected, because they seem to be great when you're sitting on the carpet and you're reading a book and you're doing calendar and you're doing all this stuff in the morning. They're great. They do their centers great. They enjoy talking about things. They love discussion. They seem high level. And then all of a sudden you give them something to do and they just don't do it well. They often have awful handwriting as well. Because reading and writing are recursive, meaning you learn them at the same time. If you've had children, you've seen this. So they start to learn to read and understand, say, their name first. And then they start to draw things that have meaning. So they'll draw all the time. I see these pictures. Okay, so they look kind of like this. Can you see it? No. There we go. There's a person with the long legs. Okay, and they start to say, oh, this is my daddy, and he's eating pickles. So the teacher will write down daddy eating pickles. So where a picture is standing for something. Now, often on these, you'll start to see things like this, where they've taken something and they have written a letter upside down, because they're still playing with letters. It can be backwards, upside down, and they were like, a pickle, right? So there's the word a pickle, 2 words. So you'll start to see kids messing with stuff. They move from that, or they'll have this sometimes too, where it looks sort of scribbly and a lot like cursive writing. See down here at the bottom? And that's them developing writing and reading recursively. You don't develop it by itself, which is why it's so sad when teachers don't give some writing time to littles. Kinder and first grade and second grade. They're so worried about the reading piece, they forget the writing piece. So by the time they get to fourth grade teachers are like, oh my God, they can't write. And that's because they haven't had the opportunity to do so. All right. So here's how we go about saying, hey, I need to start collecting data because I think my kid in my class is showing signs of dyslexia. We're going to look at the signs in just a minute. So dyslexia is defined by exclusion. So what that means is that you will have to exclude things before you're ready to test for dyslexia. Now, this order right here is in the dyslexia manual, but I will argue to you that this bottom one happens first. It's an easy thing for you as a teacher to do, and one of the most important. 50% of the kids that were sent to me every time to diagnose as a specialist, 50% of the kids that came to me, what they needed was glasses. They actually aren't dyslexic, they need glasses. And you have to realize that in school, we do test for eyesight with all the kids. For the little ones, we have a chart that is, I should put a chart up here, but they have a chart that's not letters because the kids don't know the letters yet. So what they have are like arrows. And so the kid will do a thumb up if the arrow is up, thumb down if it's down, to the right, to the left, that kind of thing, and they use their thumbs. Now remember, a dyslexic kid might be 7th or 8th in line, right? So they're a class of 21, and they're waiting in time, and they're 7. There are 7 people in front of them. And so what do they do? What do they do while the other kids are taking the eye test? One kid at a time, up there. What are they doing? High intelligence kiddos who don't like to fail. What do you think?
They're listening to other people's responses and memorizing them.
Perfect. Yes. They memorize them. And so like Tamara said, it's like what happens is they're watching and then they can kind of do it. Because remember, this is high intelligence and they don't want to fail anything. Nobody wants to fail. It's like when you go to the DMV, you don't want to fail the eye test. You just don't want to fail the eye test. And I don't want to wear my glasses either. Like I want to say that I can if I want to, but in general, I don't wear my glasses when I'm driving. So I don't want to fail the test. Like, I don't want to fail the test. And that's how dyslexic kids are too. So they often get through because they gather information. As they come into second grade, it goes into the letters. And that's where we really start to see that kids need glasses. They go in and they remember, in the long line, that's not where we're noticing that they need glasses. Usually, even with the letters, they are copying what they hear. What happens for you in the classroom is if you are seeing a kid that you think might be dyslexic, they're flipping some words, they've got some tracking issues, all of these different signals that we're going to look at in a second, you say, yeah, I need to look at them. The first thing you need to do is talk to the reading specialist, and then they need to go in for a vision and a hearing test individually with the nurse. Doesn't cost them anything. And if the nurse says, hey, yeah, they have an issue with their vision, they need to go and see an ophthalmologist. Just so that you know, it's all covered on CHIP. So if your kids are low socioeconomic and you know that it's going to be a strain on them, they can use their CHIP insurance to go, and it doesn't cost them anything. I like to have an ophthalmologist that I knew worked with CHIP, so that when a kid came back to me, now this is as a specialist, you would not be having to coordinate this, but as a specialist, I would have a person that I could send them to that I knew worked with CHIP, and they would come out with glasses for like $25. But 50% of the kids that came to me for testing needed glasses. It wasn't that they were dyslexic; it's that they couldn't see the different parts of the letter. I would have kids that would say things to me like, "Oh, a Q has a little line in it. That's what they mean." They just hadn't seen the little line. So it looked like an O all the time, and it was hard to read because, it was supposed to be the word queen, and they were owing, owing, that kind of thing. So getting them glasses. You can see this in our world, because when you start seeing kids with glasses, it's usually about second or third grade they get glasses. When they're really little, like babies, when babies have glasses, they usually have some sort of other health impairment that's gone on that then a special pediatric person has decided, hey, we should, get glasses. We can see that her eyes are too big, or there, things going on internally, so they get them glasses, and they're real cute, and they got the little band behind their head and all that stuff. But in general, kids don't get glasses until about second grade, and that's because that's where they start to learn their letters, and we can really catch them. So 50%. So first, have their vision and hearing tested. They are tricky people because they are smart and they don't want to fail. But when you put them in there by themselves, they do very differently than the whole class. Okay. Second thing that's really hard, and I would put second, is that we support the parents. Now, when you say you support the parents, what you're going to be doing is giving calls to the parents, like, hey, I'm noticing some issues. Jenny's running a little slow here. Here's what I think is going on. I want to make sure that we're supporting Jenny as much as we can. Now, your goal is to get in touch with the parent, let them know that things are going to be coming home for them to work with. Okay, so it could be books that they're rereading. It could be lessons that there are extra. It could, right? Now, after you've done your due diligence with the parent, you've talked to them, you're trying to call them, every couple days, you really are trying to get the parent to be involved. You can't make a parent do anything, though. You can't, even if you send stuff home. Some parents will do it, some parents won't. Some parents will do it for a couple days, and some parents won't. Some parents will tell you things like, well, she has her desk in her room, and I make her sit there. Okay, well, that's the start, right? Like, here she has homework time. But the piece here is that you tried. That you literally have taken this particular kid and said, let's try to support more at home. Let's remind the parent that support needs to be at home. So after you said, well, I've excluded that, like, I've tried, they are getting support at home. Then you're like, okay, well, how is their general intelligence? Would you say that they are adequate compared to every other kid in the class? Does it seem like they're typical when they're participating in other ways? They seem fine. Then you're like, okay, it's not low intelligence. They seem fine compared to every other third grader. Like, she looks kind of like a third grader. So then you're like, okay, it's not that. It's not a lack of support at home. It's not vision and it's not hearing. And we hope it's not poor instruction in the classroom, meaning that you as a teacher have not done anything to help. You just teach to the middle and hope and pray that the bottom does their best, or that you facilitate the bottom. So if we can say that we've excluded all of these things, it's not intelligence, it's not a lack of support at home, it's not poor instruction in my classroom, and it's not vision and hearing, then I need to start collecting things for a dyslexia intervention. Okay? And if you talk to the dyslexia person on your campus, or your reading specialist, if they are the dyslexia specialist, they'll tell you this. They're going to tell you, start to collect a portfolio for the kid. And you're going to be looking for areas where the child, in terms of phonological processing, so how letters and sounds work, are struggling. It can be notes that you make about the kid. It can be papers that are given. It can be writing. It can be reading. It can be, like I said, some sort of formal or informal pieces. Formal tests should be a part of it. So if we've got an old STAR test or something, that can be in there as well. It's not the only thing that's in there. High stakes people. Okay. So after we've said no, like all of these things, the kid is not low. The kid is not having, it's not an issue with support. It's not an issue with instruction. It's not an issue with vision and hearing. We say, okay, well, physically, what's going on? We say, can they see? Can they hear? We say, okay, that's good. We've got that. Kid And by the way, if the kid gets glasses and they come in and they're like, "Hey, I got glasses, miss, look at my glasses." Like they got Hello Kitty on the sides and they have their glasses, and that's great. You need to be waiting about 2 weeks or so before you start gathering if you think the kid needs dyslexia services, because it takes a little while to get used to your glasses, especially for kids. They've never looked through the glasses before. So they start to notice things while you're teaching and that they never noticed before. And that can be really overwhelming for their brain because they're like, "Oh my gosh," you're like, "Oh, cool." And so you want to wait about 2 weeks before you start really gathering things for a kid that did get glasses, but you still think there's an issue going on. Okay? All right, then you got language problems. Those of you that were in 3314 or 15, you would have the early literacy class. You probably have the teaching reading source book, the core. That is probably the best book out there. It has really great interventions that are multisensory for teaching all kids, but certainly going back and teaching kids that are in the upper grades that still need phonics, because kids in your upper grades are not going to need the same phonics as kindergarten kids. It's a mistake that a lot of schools make. They'll put kids on a computer to do a phonics program when they're in 5th grade, and they did that same program when they were in 1st grade. It's not developmentally appropriate. Okay, we're going to come to this chart in just a second. So ESL kids is another language factor. Now, mind you, ESL or ELL kids, they can come from everywhere. In San Antonio, though, mostly what we see is Mexican immigrants. So if they come into your classroom, they are speaking Spanish as their first language. That, of course, is something that we have to kind of understand and take note of when we're looking at a dyslexic kid. I'll tell you that it is harder to diagnose an ELL kid who's speaking Spanish if we're not really clear about what the difference between language learning, just learning to speak English, learning to write in English, learning to understand how we work in the classroom, versus now there's an issue. Now, if you are scared of doing that, you're like, "I don't know what to do. Is it a language issue or is it dyslexia?" What I would tell you is take a look at how they're writing those letters, how they're understanding when they read. Hispanic kiddos who speak Spanish, it's an easy language to learn because it's a one-to-one correspondence always. So once they have that one-to-one correspondence, they should be able to apply that to a new language, because remember, they're little, they're not old like us, and old like us means learning new languages is hard. Littles, at the same time they start learning a language, they often can even take the second language and be better at it than the first language if they don't get any language help, which we want bilingual kiddos. So we want them to be in dual language programs as much as we can. We don't want to push them out. We want them to actually develop academic language in both of those areas. So for our Spanish-speaking kiddos, if they can take that one-to-one correspondence and apply it, it's going to take them a little bit longer as they're learning the language, but they'll come up to grade level pretty quickly. When you see a kid who is Spanish-speaking that's taking a long time to learn English, that is something you should go, okay, this might be a kid that I want to test. All right, and so what are you testing? What are you assessing? Phonology, phonemes, sound systems, semantics, meaning, like morphology, like do they understand horse versus horses, syntactic, how they create sentences. And so this becomes a language factor that you also have to pay attention to all of these with your ELL kid as well. Okay, are they using their first language to inform the second language, English, or are they just learning English? Are they still translating? Because if they're translating English to Spanish, say the color of something or the adjective will often be after the noun. So in Spanish, you might say la cabeza azul, right? Instead of the blue brain, it's the brain blue. So that would be sort of an example of that. Okay, syntactics, how you put it in the sentence, and pragmatics, does it make sense overall? Okay, so that would be what your language factors look like. Are there any questions on this sort of stuff right here? At the end, you can ask me all sorts of questions about dyslexia. Somebody asked in the last class, do I know anything about adults and dyslexia? And the truth is, I don't. Okay, last thing, intellectual factors. We include attendance in that because, of course, if they're not attending school, then you obviously have an issue with instruction because they're not getting all of the instruction. So you would be hoping that one of the ways you can tell intellectual factors is if they are in school all the time and they're still struggling to learn. Okay. If they're not, attendance or tardiness, like you might have your language arts block quite often, it's in the morning because you're the longest period of time, and you have a kid that doesn't come in until 9:59 every day. because the mom's tired and she works at night, and you totally understand, but he's missing most of the language arts lesson, which means there's going to be a huge discrepancy for that kid. Okay? The older they get, the bigger the discrepancy. I'm going to show you some charts in just a minute. All right, so what are some of the stumbling blocks to becoming a good reader? So where are the areas that you can end up falling apart on? This would be dyslexic kids are going to fall apart. All kids actually are going to fall apart here if they're struggling to read. They're going to have trouble reading the words accurately, like decoding those words and then chunking them together and knowing what they are. And certainly they're going to have trouble with fluency, which is prosody, so what it sounds like, speed, how fast they're reading it, and accuracy. Those are the 3 parts of fluency. Okay, they're going to, they're going to have an insufficient vocabulary, right? So it could be that the reason they're struggling is because they just have a low vocabulary and their reasoning skills are sort of low. Now remember, a dyslexic kid often is going to be high intelligence, so you might see some kids struggling with insufficient vocabulary. Quite often with our dyslexic kids, that's not where they stumble. They stumble actually on number 1. They end up with problems on number 3, an absence or loss of motivation to read, because it's so hard and they're not good at it. Nobody wants to do what they're not good at over and over and over again, and that's exactly what happens to a lot of our kids. They are overwhelmed by the amount of reading because they have to use so much of their brain, and it's so difficult all the time, and it's so hard all the time that by 10 o'clock they're exhausted. And then they start feeling like they're not a good reader, they're stupid, they're dumb, they hate it. And imagine if you had to do what you thought you were stupid at, what you thought you were bad at, over and over and over again. And it just kept reminding you that you're not good enough. Your self-efficacy is bad. Your self-esteem becomes bad. And the more you have bad self-esteem, the increase in that means you're not going to read as much. And I argue a lot of times with even other faculty in reading, when I was at UT Austin specifically, some here, but a lot at UT Austin, we would have outright like belief system fights, because I think the first thing that parents and teachers need to work on with a kid that you think is struggling in reading, dyslexia or not, is self-efficacy and motivation. They have affect issues, and when you feel like you're not good at something, you're not motivated to do it because it doesn't feel like you're getting better at it. Have I told you the Paletta story about the Paletta man? Me roller skating? Anybody chat with me? Tell me if I have. Have I told you? Yes. Okay. So it's like that. It would be like me saying, it takes so much time for me to learn. It was so hard for me to do, and I did a bad job at it. I don't keep doing it. Like after I hit the Paletta man, I don't roller skate anymore because I feel bad at it. And the truth is, like, I feel like I could fall at any time, and I'm not good at it, and people laugh at me, and like all those things come up for me, even though it's just roller skating. Like, but for this, it's literacy. It's one of the biggest things, one of the biggest factors that we know success in school is about. It's not about how good a scientist you are, how good of a history person you are. It's literally about how good do you read science and history and ELAR and art and music, and it's so overwhelming. Okay, so in order to be a proficient comprehender, which is our goal, right, you have decoding and meaning making, that's the comprehension part, equals reading. So it's not just the decoding that we need, which is the first part, that's the red thing that you see, the red line. Those are accurate and fluent word reading skills. We need that, but we also need oral language skills, conceptual knowledge, which is why you're building prior knowledge and background knowledge. We need help with strategies in order to be able to apply what we know onto the text and repair something if it doesn't make sense. That metacognitive act. We need them to understand something, and sometimes they get to the end of the story and they read it, but they don't understand it. And that's, of course, the reasoning and inferential skills. I'll also tell you that every classroom I've ever worked in has trouble with summarization and inferencing. I would argue that that's because it's developmental. As kids get older, they're much more able to infer about what would happen. When they're little, they actually don't know what would happen. It's why they want to stick their finger on the stove, even though mom says no. Or mom says, don't run around, you're going to get hurt. And they want to know why. And so they end up doing something just to figure out why. And that's inferential. So you'll have a hard time in your classroom, I guarantee it. And then the last one is motivation. I find it the most important thing because I think if you're not motivated to read, you don't do it. If you're not motivated to come to school, you don't want to come. At the beginning of the school year, you're very motivated usually. As a college student, you're motivated. You got your new spiral notebook. Everything's ready. You got your cute little stuff from Target. If you're like me, you got your cute little stuff from Target. You're ready for the year. 18 weeks later, when you're at the end, you're like, can barely motivate yourself to come to class. It's like, oh, I wish I could watch Dr. Phil. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So Extreme difficulties mastering phonics, or that phonological piece, means that they're having difficulty with blending and analyzing sounds, the phonemic awareness part. They're also struggling with letter sound correspondences that seem abnormal for other kids compared to other kids in the class, and specifically for that kid. Because you're like, this kid loves when we're reading aloud a book. He answers all these questions. He asks questions. He loves when I'm teaching. He wants to add to the writing that we're doing as a whole class. He seems right with me, but when he has to do it on his own, he's got issues with blending, issues with analyzing, issues with letter sound correspondences. Also, he has low sight vocabulary, meaning that they don't have the sight words quickly. So they're still sounding out or trying to find places in their brain where those words that should be very easy for a fifth grader are still kind of hard for a fifth grader. All right, so I want to show you right here. I want to show you what a fifth grader who's struggling might sound like. So when you hear this, I want you to remember, this kid is a fifth grader. Okay, so I want you to pay attention to what do you notice is happening for this fifth grader, and why do you think that she is someone that we should look at for a reading disability or a reading problem? What is it that's going on for her as she's reading? Fifth grader.
Your brilliant first flop was a rapping success. Come on, let's get busy. And on the next, she handed a notebook and Rosie Revere, who smiled at her aunt as it all became clear. Life might have its flutters, but this was not it. The true flutter can come if you quit.
Okay. So what are your noticings there? What do you notice?
I noticed that she skipped over.
Hold on, sorry. YouTube started going crazy. Okay. What do you notice?
I noticed that she skipped over a few words, and then I noticed that the longer the words were, the more likely she was to like flip her letters around or move them around, I guess you could say, because like I already forgot what word it was, but she changed it to flutter.
Yeah, failure.
Or something like
failure
that.
To flutter.
Failure, there it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's inserting words that don't really make sense, but kind of fit the pattern in her mind. So that starts with an S or an F, and she's going to pick a word that comes to her mind that starts with an F. She just picks it. Yes, absolutely. Even though it's the incorrect word, and she uses it later on too. So she sees the same word, failure, a second time, and she says flutter as well. She's already figured it out, even though it's incorrect. What else did you notice? Come on, people.
She also is not like she pauses when she's reading, so it's not like fluent. Like it's not like oh she's pausing.
Yeah, and what is she pausing on? What words is she often stuck on? Did you notice? Well, let's look at her again. Okay. I don't even know what that is. Why is it there?
Brilliant. First,
okay. I want you to pay attention to which words that you also see her kind of struggling at that might be weird that she's struggling with them. Like failure is a bigger word, although she probably should know it by 5th grade. But do you see her struggling on any other words?
Flop. Your brilliant first flop was a rapping success. Come on, let's get busy. And on the next.
So did you hear there? So right there, and on to the next, and on to, she's struggling.
She handed a notebook and Rosie Revere.
What word did she just miss?
The word
two.
Yeah, two. I mean, she should have that word. That should be such a quick word. It's a kindergarten word. We learned that in kinder on our little sight word list.
Who smiled at her aunt as it.
There it is again. 2-letter words. She's struggling. She still kind of has to take it through her brain, has to figure out all the synapses start flowing, and it takes it a little minute to come out for her.
All became clear. Life might have its flutters, but this was not it. The true flutter can come if you quit.
Okay. So hopefully this time, when you were kind of, I don't want this to play on. Don't play.
Really it.
Okay. Hopefully you heard that she struggles somewhat on those small words that she should know just as much as she might struggle on a big word. So she misses flutters for failure, but she's also sort of slowing down her prosody when she gets to sight words. The, and.
A participant has joined the meeting.
Calling user. Okay. So that's probably who just called. Was like, let me in. All right. So when they're struggling that way, that's what a 5th grade reader sounds like when they have dyslexia. When they are just a struggling 5th grade reader, they're going to make a lot more mistakes. And quite often, they're at least 2 grade levels below. Now, if I was to read that book out loud to her, she would have no problem answering comprehension skills. In general, dyslexic kids have very high listening comprehension. So the listening comprehension seems like, hey, if I read it to the kid and they answer questions, they're pretty good. Like, what is happening when it doesn't match up with when I'm giving them the passage to read on their own, even if it's the same passage? So we read the passage together. I send the kid to their desk. They're having to do it on their own, and the fluency is a problem. The ability for them to keep at it because it takes so much brain. It's why a dyslexic kid quite often at the end of the school day is exhausted. They are exhausted. They'll often come home and take a nap. Like, that's how exhausted they are. Because it requires so much all the time that they're on and so much for them to read. So when you might be teaching 5th grade or, K-5, that kind of thing, when you're in those older grades, recognize that when your kids are struggling with reading, it takes so much brain that they often are tired. You'll see kids who lay down with their arm on their desk like this just because they're exhausted, whether it's because they didn't sleep at home, which is often what people think. It can also be that they did sleep at home, but the work that you're having them do is really at the level that they're at, and so therefore their brain is tired and their brain starts to shut down. It's the same reason that after you've read 2 or 3 pages in your textbook, you start to feel like you're going to fall asleep. It's not because you don't like it, it's just because it requires so much brain power to get the comprehension that's on 2 or 3 of those Bible-thin pages that you feel exhausted by the time you're done, and you're starting out exhausted, right? But you might be able to read more pages if you were reading from a mystery book or a romance book or whatever your favorite book is, Harry Potter. You might read more pages before you get tired and fall asleep. So last thing, couple last things. When you have kids who have specific reading disabilities known as dyslexia, you're going to see them having weaknesses in their phonological area of language ability that should seem very intrinsic, like they sort of take it in and now they're able to use it. That's what happens with most kids. With your dyslexic kid, instead of taking 4 or 5 times to see a word, it takes 10 or 12 times and it still comes out slower. They learn it, but it comes out slower. You saw that in that little girl's reading. It took her a minute to come to the word an, A-N, while she was reading. And so those sort of abilities seem funny for you or not in good contrast, because when you're talking to the kid and you're having a great time and they're discussing in class, it seems like they're really great. They're a fabulous, fun student to be around. And then they get their reading work and they struggle with it. And their writing work often comes comorbid, meaning that when I have issues with dyslexia, quite often the comorbidity will be dyslexia as well, because they develop at the same time. Okay, so even if they're not diagnosed as dysgraphic, the writing part, dysgraphia, just know that they probably have symptoms of dysgraphia, even if they've not been diagnosed dysgraphic. You're going to see issues with their handwriting and things like that when they have dyslexia. And the third sort of disability, we have dyslexia, dysgraphia, which is the writing. So dyslexia is the reading, specific to phonological processing, letters and sounds. Then you have dysgraphia, which is the writing portion, taking what they have in their head and putting it down. And then the last one you have is dyscalculia, which is issues with mathematics. We don't see it as often. We certainly don't diagnose it as often. one of the main things with dyscalculia, just really quickly, is to have kids use graph paper. That way they can put numbers in little boxes and it'll help to line them up. Because one of the problems with dyslexic kids, or true also with dysgraphic and also with the dyscalculia kids, is they have trouble lining things up. They have trouble tracking over time. So graph paper is an easy way to start that. All right. So lastly, let me just show you a couple charts to kind of prove where what the problem is. So here we have, and just to look at the chart, you've got your average kid, your average, just typical average kiddo right here on the blue line in first grade, right? So here they are in first grade. They're right at their level in first grade. Then you have a kid who's showing in the bottom 20%. So they're showing issues with phonemic awareness and letter knowledge. And when they're showing that difference, they're just a little bit below first grade. Not horrible. You're not freaking out about them yet, but you know they're a little low as you send them on to second grade, right? They're just a little low. In second grade, the teacher works with them. They're still learning phonics. They still are working on some of the higher level phonics, derivation. They're starting to know prefixes and suffixes, and they're doing some writing and all that stuff. And so, you still have your low kid just a little bit below where they need to be. So if you look over here, now they're in second grade. And so right here, they should be in second grade. And this kid's still typically low. The gap is still there, and the gap is about the same. You see the gap from here to here is about the same as the gap from here to here. Now then, in third grade, the gap starts to grow. And that's where these kids start needing to read to learn. So it's like take your history book home and read, chapter 4, pages 1 to 10. And you start seeing this huge gap in the ability for the kid to do it on their own. Okay, so remember, phonemic awareness and letter knowledge is dyslexia. That's how we define it. So when we see this big gap happening, it's going to get bigger over time, so much so that by the time they're in fifth grade, think about the fifth grade reader you just listened to. She sounds like and is reading around second grade. But really, the average kiddo now is able to use all of that in order to comprehend, and they're reading at their grade level, if not a little bit above. So the gap widens as the kid gets older if they're not getting the services that they need. Let's look at another one. So here we have, So here we've got, so let me describe you the difference. So this one was just their phonics ability here. And letter knowledge. This one, we're looking at their word reading. So when they're reading the whole word instead of sound, there's the sounds and letter correspondences. Now you've got whole word reading. And the same thing happens. All of a sudden, you got the ones that are a little bit below and the ones that are average, and then the gap gets bigger and bigger. So as soon as they're reading to learn, you're going to see these kids as really struggling because they can't memorize all the words. They can't. It gets too hard. There's too many words in English. And they learned they tried to memorize them all. And that's why they often struggle as soon as they get to these older grades where they have to apply what they learned. Here's another one. This one is comprehension. This is the one that I'm always interested in because my goal is that they have phonemic awareness. Of course, they're able to use those sounds. I need them to decode. I need them to move past decoding and into comprehension because what's the point of reading just letters and sounds? They got to use that for comprehension purposes. So here you've got a kid. Now, mind you, what's really interesting about these is that they have the same verbal ability. So if you were to do a listening comprehension or a verbal test with them, they're going to show up very similarly. But then when I test them just in areas of reading comprehension based on those kids who are in the bottom of the class for phoneme awareness and letter knowledge, so remember, they're equal in terms of their verbal ability, they're low in terms of their phoneme awareness, that when I start looking at them, they start a little bit lower, right? Here's your low kids, the gap is pretty small. In comprehension, the gap is pretty small, but the older that they get, the bigger the gap gets. Because this kid here is gathering knowledge, and this kid is trying to gather knowledge, and they're tired, and it's overwhelming, and it becomes such a problem that the gap gets huge. And so they're not able to pass their STAR tests, but even as they go into high school, their end-of-course tests, their EOCs, they struggle all the way through and will often tell you they're bad readers or they're stupid or that they hate tests. They have all this anxiety around tests, and it started in kindergarten. This is a kindergarten first grade assessment that we're looking at here, but we can assess all the way through, and we see the bigger that the gaps are when they're little, as they start getting older, the bigger the gap is going to be at the end. Okay. So we know that it's phonological. We know that it's difficult to acquire phonemic awareness for these kids, and it interferes with their ability to grow and to learn in the classes. Often it's comorbid with dysgraphia, right? So they start to have issues with their writing because reading and writing is recursive. And so in order to get what's in their head on the paper, it's a struggle. That's why handwriting is one of the ways that we can start to look at a dyslexic kid. We're about to look at that. Also comorbid often with dyslexia is ADHD. just so that you know. And that just has to do with how your brain processes. Okay. So some of the characteristics of dyslexia, this is just a simple chart. I have another one I'm going to show you just before we get done today. This is one I like because it's fairly easy. I used to print a couple of these out and just have them in class so that when I saw something happening, I could either pull the paper from the kid as an example, like, oh, this kid, I can see it right here. They're having trouble blending. And so I can pull it, write a little note on it, and put it into a portfolio so that I'm gathering information to help the reading specialist as the reading specialist starts to diagnose. Because they'll come back to you anyway. They'll say, I need proof. This is your proof. So you take something like this. Now, almost all of you have probably heard that in dyslexia they flip letters or they reverse them. That's true. Often they do. You also need to realize that that's a very normal developmental thing. So if they're doing that in kindergarten, first grade, pre-K, it's pretty okay that they're doing it. By first grade, you should start to see them doing more letters, that are up on the lines or that are capitals and they're not upside down and that sort of stuff. You start to see that. By second grade, they shouldn't be doing that anymore. That's why we test in second grade, because developmentally in kinder, it's hard to know. Like if they're doing all these other things, yes, but you're still not going to be able to test in Texas before second grade. So you're gathering stuff to give to the reading specialist, showing, hey, my kindergarten kid, I think this is happening for them. All right, so here's some of the things. Of course, the first big one is blending and breaking apart sounds and words. They have trouble blending words. The longer the word, the more difficult it is, the more likely they are to substitute words. They have poor spelling. So you give a spelling test at the end, and even though they did the homework every night, they do not do it well. Because they have trouble with the sound correspondences, they try to memorize how to spell the words, and as the words get harder, it becomes more difficult for them. They often have messy handwriting. They can't read something themselves. They are delayed in speaking. So if you ask the parent, quite often they start off speaking a little bit later, even if they speak more. So you have a kid that instead of saying bottle or baba, they say baba, please. So when they start talking with 2 and 3 word phrases, and you're like, whoa, she pretty, that kind of thing. Hi, mom. But they never went mom, 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 ma, right? They only do da, 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 da. They never did ma, ma, ma. They just hi, mama, hi, mama, right? Okay. Trouble tracking. This is one of the really big ones. So you definitely have trouble with them flipping letters and numbers, and let me show you why. This is my awful thing. So here in English is why this is such a problem for a dyslexic kid. So when you look at this here, you have a P. I turn it over this way, and you have a D. Sometimes it looks like a 6. I turn it over this way, and I have a Q, or a number 9. And I turn it over this way, and I have a B. So we have a B, a P, a Q, a 9, and a 6. And it just depends on how it works. And in the world, that's not how things happen. In the world, like this is a pen. It's a pen if it's on my head. It's a pen if it's on the ground. It's a pen if it's broken. It's still a pen. So everything's the same. But when you get to the English language and how our written word works, it's not the same. Sometimes we use a PH instead of an F. Now, there's reasons for it, but when you're 6, do they need the reasons? No, they just need to know that sometimes that happens. So it's like, it becomes so complicated. All right, so tracking is one of the big ones that I will say here. All kids who are dyslexic struggle with this. And this means that when they're reading a book, they often miss a line, like they'll skip a line. One of the easiest things you can do to see if the kid is really struggling with this is to make sure all of your kids are using either the finger, which the older the kids are, the less likely they are to use their finger. They don't like to use it. They think it's a baby thing. But I have index cards, and I would use index cards all the time, some sort of bookmark that they can move down as they read, and we have to practice with it over and over again so they don't miss lines. I used to, when I was teaching, I wore a Home Depot apron. It's just the bottom part, and it had like 4 pockets in it in the front. And one of the things I always kept in there was note cards. They could color on the note card if they wanted to. They could make it all cute and bring it back to class, but that was what they were going to use when they were reading. And sometimes I would say, here, use this. You got 5 minutes to color it, because otherwise all they want to do is color it. So you give them time to do what you want them to do, and then they're likely to do it. So I always had an index card, something that's going to help them track. The older they are, the less likely they are to use their finger. Words may wiggle or swim. That's part of the reversal piece. They substitute another word. They have trouble rhyming. They guess word sounds. So like flutter and failure, kind of parts of it are okay. They have trouble copying things down from the board to the paper. So if you're in a 5th grade class and you have kids taking notes, like you're teaching them how to take notes, your dyslexic kid should really have most of the notes beforehand. Sometimes it could have blanks, sometimes they could add to the notes or draw a picture. But if you have the kid writing the notes one by one as you write the notes, they're going to be slower and they're going to become frustrated with it. And then when you look at what they wrote, it looks like a mess. It's certainly not going to be something that helps them to study. So it becomes really important that when you are working with kids with dyslexia or possible dyslexia, that you provide some of those notes for them. Okay. Difficulty with word retrieval, may talk around a word. So dyslexic kids are funny. They were talking to you about whatever. So I had one the other day. It's like I had this bottle of water, which obviously I'm not drinking enough of. The same bottle. And I was sitting here when I was like working with him. So he says, "What kind of water is it?" And I was like, "Oh, it's called life water," to show him. And then he was like, "Oh, that's funny because when we're alive and we go through things and there's all this stuff. What's that called, miss?" I was like, "What do you mean?" And he just kept going, "It's like when you are doing your dream and you're at it." And I was like, "Oh, you mean having a good life?" He was like, "Yeah, so if you drink the water, you have a good life." Even though he had just seen the word life, like talked around it, couldn't figure out what it is. Like it's not coming to you. And it's one thing when you're old and it doesn't come to you. I don't know if we got anybody that's in their 40s. It's not like that. It's instead, young people shouldn't have that sort of issue recalling and bringing it forward. If you think about dyslexia, think about it. The metaphor I like to use is driving. So if you are typical and you don't have any issues with it, when you're coming to campus, you're going to hop on I-10 or 410, sometimes both of them, 281. You're taking the highways and you get there. You can be so agile at your driving at this point that sometimes you don't actually pay attention to your drive, and you were trying to head to Costco, which kind of on the way, and then all of a sudden you're like, I was supposed to go to work, or I was going to go to Costco, but I went all the way to work. I made the wrong turn. I turned like I was going to work because it's so easy for you to do. And you're pretty fast at it. You know exactly how long it's going to take you to get there, and you run in and it's all good. Your dyslexic kid, on the other hand, can never take a highway. They don't take a highway at all. They have to always take feeder roads. Now, are they going to get there? Yeah. Is it going to take them longer in the beginning? Yes, because you get to get on the highway. You're typical. Your dyslexic kid has to take Zarzamora all the way down, or has to get onto all of these little side streets because they're not allowed on the highway. Now, over time, they get better at using Zarzamora. Like they know when the traffic's going to be outside of the Jiffy Lube. They know when the lights are going to turn. They sort of are like, okay, I can leave at 4:32 and I can get there by 5. All right, okay, this is what needs to happen. Now, are they ever as fast as the highway? Generally, no. I'm not talking about if there's traffic, but generally no. But will they get faster at taking those feeder roads? Yes, they will. That faster part usually doesn't come until the upper elementary grades, though, 7 and 8, like kind of middle school, 6, 7, and 8, somewhere in there. You're going to start to see them gathering these strategies, and they become better readers. Do they still have dyslexia? Yes. You never get rid of it because it has to do with those synapses. Like it's how your brain is encoded. So you don't get rid of it, you just get faster at taking those feeder roads. So if I were to look at a dyslexic kid versus a typical kid or a normal kid in an fMRI machine, I'm going to see things happen that are similar, but they're going to happen at different speeds. So your dyslexic kid over here, they're going to go in through the occipital lobe, it's going to move all around, it's going to come back, and it takes it 3.2 trilliseconds in order to pull up what a dog is. Your typical kid is going to take 1 trillisecond, and it's just going to go in through the occipital lobe, straight through your left frontal lobe, and come right back out. Like a dog. Like it's a poodle, it's a husband, they know all these things about it. So it has to do with the processing and has to do with the speed. Because your dyslexic kid is going, oh, okay, the word is dog. Dog. Oh, dog. Then it goes in and it moves sort of slower. Your other kid is like dog. Like that. So let me show you a couple things. So I'm going to show you a couple sites that I like. And I will put up the PowerPoint so you can have that stuff. So if you're somebody who wants to really know what is developmentally appropriate for kiddos, which is why we don't test kids usually in kindergarten, and that's because they're just learning how to use these letters and sounds. We have to see how good they are at it. You will see arguments for testing kids really, really early. I don't know that I feel like you need to test kids early, but do I think that you should start compiling evidence for it? Yes, when you see kids that are struggling. So what I'm showing you right here is 6 to 7 years. So this would be like second grade when you're starting to get ready. But you can even look, if you're a pre-K person or a Head Start person that's getting your degree, you can look all the way back. And they have some that are a little later as well. So what it's showing you is what the kids should be able to do. So by 6 or 7, so you're talking about second grade, you're going to see things like reduced interest in writing and drawing. They don't want to do it, or they do it, they're the ones who color the picture and you keep telling them to go back and fill up the page. They're able to draw particular things, but they're not proportionate or they look a little weird. In general, your dyslexic kids also, they struggle with these sort of basic drawing pieces. It's getting what's in your head down on the paper. They'll often, so things that they do really well, they'll engage in conversations. They've got a receptive vocabulary of 20,000 words. Your dyslexic kid probably doesn't have 20,000 words memorized. Then down here, it'll sort of show you what sounds the kids should be doing. And you'll notice that girls and boys are different. Sometimes, like right here, the girl is doing it faster and longer than the boy is doing it. In general, your girls have, the girls are less likely to be diagnosed as dyslexic, and some would say that that's because they're just being missed.
A participant has left the meeting.
Oh, geez, somebody left. They're done with me because I know class is over. So, but here, what you see is that the girls quite often are better with fine motor. They're also better with language pieces in the beginning. This levels off by the time they're in third grade. Fourth grade, they are very similar. But in the beginning, girls will learn more words more quickly than boys learn more words. So this is one that I kind of like. And they have a ton of stuff that you can kind of look at here. One last one before I let you go. This one is Dyslexia Help. It's out of the University of Michigan, which I've worked with. I think University of Michigan, great school. What I like about this is there's all sorts of free stuff, especially for kids that you're like, oh my God, I have this dyslexic kid. What do I do? They've got things like book scanning services where they'll scan a book for you, say your history book, if you don't have the CDs for it, and that way the kid can listen to the book while following along. One of the best things that you can do with a kid is have them do that. So if you're a parent of a kid who's struggling with reading, have them listen to the book, but they need the text in front of them so that they're following with that as well. So book scanning, things like they've got a dyslexia quiz where you can have the kid take it, talk with the kid about it, talk with don't keep these things a secret. I've had so many kids who will say I have dyslexia, but they don't really know what it means or what it is. So they'll often leave and they feel stupid. But if they know what it is and they say, oh, my brain process is different, then I'm not so sad about it. I just know that it's true. Like, this is what happens. So anyway, this is some of the stuff. And of course, up here, you've got lots of other things. There's lots of other different things you can work through. These are just a couple of signs. You can Google dyslexia and all sorts of stuff come up. Just make sure you're using a good site. NIHouse, Florida State, those that you've heard of before, and Scottish Rite. NIHouse and Scottish Rite are the two in Texas that are the biggest. For you to look at other options concerning it, concerning dyslexia. And I will definitely tell you, especially based on some of your quizzes, take a look at the dyslexia handbook, okay, that I put up there. Just because that's probably one of the greatest things that you can pay attention to understand what dyslexia is. All right, so what questions do you have? None? I always wish we were face-to-face when it's like these little classes. Like there's just a few of you guys right now, and it's like, oh man, if we were face-to-face, we'd get to look at all these dyslexia interventions and like, so much fun, especially when there's only like 10 people instead of like 40 people. It's so much fun. And I really love teaching you guys. Whereas I'm home now, and it's kind of like, oh, I wish I was somewhere else teaching you guys. Well, I'm glad you came in. Make sure that you've kind of put in the chat like, hello, I'm here, because I got 2 classes in the chat. 2 classes in the chat at this minute. I'm going to stop the recording.